friends. I wanted to read you a story today called Snaggletail. And I wanted to read this particular story about birds because it's about a bird who is different and how sometimes even animals are not kind to their friends because they're different. And we'll talk about that at the end. It's a story by Dovey St. Peters. This is Snaggletail. He has kind of a crooked tail. Deep in the heart of Texas, there grew a large old live oak. The hawk is in the backyard. Now this was not just any old tree, but a very special tree. It grew in the most sacred soil in Texas, the Alamo. The tree was beautiful, but it was also useful. Its leaves and branches provided a cool shade for many people from all over the world who came to visit the Alamo each year to learn about the history of Texas. It also provided a wonderful home for several families of birds. It was like a neighborhood for birds. A family of doves lived in the upper branches of the tree, and their ooh-ah, coo-coo-coo could be heard near and far during the cool hours of the early morning. Some robins built their nest of mud and twigs on a lower branch where Mr. and Mrs. Robin carefully guarded the 4 blue eggs resting in the soft nest. A woodpecker, here's the woodpecker, and here's the robins. And I think we're gonna talk about him. The woodpecker, although not a resident of the tree, that means he doesn't live in the tree, he visited often to climb the trunk and tap away with his strong bill. He hoped to find insects burrowing in the bark, but he mostly annoyed the screech owl as he nested in a cavity in a little higher in the tree trunk. He looks a little annoyed, doesn't he? The owl, who hunted at night and liked to sleep in the daytime, just couldn't get a good day's sleep with the constant tap, tap, tap of the woodpecker. Eventually, he got used to the noise and found it even more difficult to sleep without it. All in all, the birds lived happily together in the tree until the mockingbirds nested in the tree next door. Mrs. Mockingbird seemed fine, but there was something weird about Mr. Mockingbird. Oh, they were used to hearing mockingbirds hoot like an owl, coo like a dove, and warble the song of the robin to perfection. Mockingbirds, they're called mockingbirds because they mock. They say the same calls that they hear other birds making. They wouldn't be surprised to see a mockingbird hammer on the trunk of a tree like a woodpecker. All this was normal for mockingbirds, but there was something else, something very strange and different about this mockingbird. He was friendly and seemed nice enough, although he was a little bossy at times. He got loud and obnoxious whenever another bird flew anywhere near Mrs. Mockingbird's nest of 5 small blue-green eggs. But that was no problem. After all, the mockingbird was the state bird of Texas, and a superior attitude could be expected. In fact, he acted no different than any other mockingbirds. He just looked different, very different. Our state bird of Massachusetts is the black-capped chickadee. Mr. Robin first noticed the strange way his tail feather dragged the ground when they were picking up popcorn and breadcrumbs dropped by the tourists. It was hard to keep from laughing as Mr. Mockingbird strutted around as though nothing was wrong. In fact, some of the birds did laugh because Mr. Mockingbird couldn't fly very straight or very high. Yes, he was a very weird bird. Everyone wanted to know what was wrong with his tail feathers. But no one wanted to be the one to ask. The doves were much too shy, the woodpecker was much too busy going tap, tap, tap on the tree trunk, and the owl was much too wise to bring up such an unpleasant subject. The robins felt, however, for the sake of their 4 blue eggs, that they should find out something about this strange-looking neighbor. They decided to talk to the wrens. The wrens nested under the seat of a nearby park bench and seemed to know everything about everyone. Surely they were the best birds to ask. "Mr. Wren," said Mr. Robin, "do you know Mr. Mockingbird who lives in the tree next door to mine?" "Oh, you mean old Snaggletail?" "I know who he is, but I'm having nothing to do with him," said Mr. Wren. "None of the birds like him because of the ugly broken tail feather." "That makes me sad. I wonder how it was broken?" asked Mrs. Robin. Mrs. Wren chirped in, "Who knows? All I know is that I heard they nested here because they were run out of the park. Imagine what all the tourists will think of Texas birds when they see that ugly thing with his tail feather dragging the ground. Well, he's just ruining the neighborhood, and he just struts around as though nothing is wrong." Just because he has a snaggletail or a broken tail feather doesn't mean that he isn't a nice friend. Mrs. Wren didn't finish her sentence when she realized Mr. Mockingbird had joined a group of birds nearby. Just as he picked up a fluffy kernel of discarded popcorn, the other birds started hopping up and down and chirping, "Snaggletail, Snaggletail, drags along his ugly tail." Mr. Mockingbird dropped the popcorn, and he sadly spread his wings, and he flew toward his nest with his broken tail feather flapping in the breeze. He could hear the birds still taunting him as he landed on his nest. "Snaggletail, Snaggletail. Look, he has a tear. I think his feelings are hurt." "See," Mr. Wren said with a sneer, "I told you so. None of the birds like him, and he is just not good enough to live at the Alamo. When our eggs hatch, our fledglings will not be allowed to play with theirs, and I advise you to do the same, Mr. Robin." That doesn't seem very kind to me. What do you think? Oh, it looks like they're getting a little bit angry. I wonder what will happen. The robins were thinking about what the wrens had said when all of a sudden they heard a loud screech. As they looked up, they saw a large black grackle approaching the nest where the precious eggs lay unprotected. "My babies!" screamed Mrs. Robin. She and Mr. Robin quickly took flight, but she knew they could not reach the nest in time to save the eggs from the clutches of the large black bird. The loud chattering and wing flapping of an angry mockingbird filled the air. The robins were fluttering wings as Snaggletail chased the grackle away from their nest. Nothing could be seen except a broken tail feather floating softly to the ground. Poor Snaggletail! He had done them a great favor by protecting their nest while they were busy worrying that he might give a bad name to the neighborhood. They feared he had met his fate when he challenged the mighty grackle. So even though the other birds made fun of him, he still was kind and did something to help the other birds in the neighborhood. Suddenly there was a friendly chirp from somewhere above them. "Is everything okay?" Snaggletail landed on a nearby branch. "Oh, yes, Mr. Robin, and thank goodness you're okay, Snaggletail." Snaggletail dropped his head. "Sure, I'm fine." he said, and he sadly turned to fly away. Mr. Robin realized at once that he had hurt his new friend by calling him Snaggletail. He had hurt his feelings. "Wait, Mr. Mockingbird," said Mr. Robin. "It's because of your broken tail feather that you were nearby to protect our nest. It's an honor and a privilege to know you, Snaggletail, because even with the broken tail feather, you saved our family." Snaggletail raised his head and seemed to grow a little taller. "I am glad I was able to help." Just then, a cheer began from below. "Snaggletail, Snaggletail, the bravest mockingbird in Texas." Mr. Wren, who loved to spread a good story, flew all over the Alamo to tell of Snaggletail's victory over the mighty Grackle. All the birds were sorry that they had treated such a brave bird so badly, and all because he looked different. From that day on, Mr. Mockingbird was known as Snaggletail, even though he eventually grew a brand new tail feather and could proudly strut up and down the sidewalk like any other mockingbird. But he would always be different, even without dragging the tail feather behind him. After all, he was the only bird who had become a hero of the Alamo. He was the superhero in that neighborhood by scaring the bad bird away and protecting the eggs of his neighbor. He should get to put a stone in the bucket, don't you think? The end. Now, boys and girls, remember that even though somebody might look different or have something different about them, doesn't mean that they aren't a regular person with feelings just like you and me. And we should be kind to everyone, no matter what they look like or what they have or what they do. If they are kind, we should be kind back to them. That's all for today. Bye.